It's with great pleasure that I'm with you all today. Hello, everybody, wherever you are in the world. I'm looking forward to moderating this C20 Summit panel session on how to minimise the risk of a future pandemic, the role of the global wildlife trade. My name is Steve McIver, and I'm the CEO of World Animal Protection, an international animal welfare organisation working globally with stakeholders from multiple sectors, including the United Nations, governments, veterinarians, corporations, and of course, civil society, to move the world to protect animals. We work on some of the largest and most pressing animal welfare issues of our time, including industrial factory farming, where billions of animals are cruelly confined in barren cages for the food industry, and also the commercial exploitation of wildlife, where millions of wild animals suffer as exotic pets, for entertainment, for traditional medicine, and many other uses. We work passionately to help animals in these situations. Now, I'm very pleased to be joined today by an excellent and esteemed panel, including Mr. Claudio Fernandez from the NGO Gestos in Brazil. Mr. Fernandez is also on the C20 International Advisory Committee. Professor Scott Weiss from Ontario Veterinary College in Canada is also with us, and Dr. Juliana Mercado Ferreira, founder and executive director of Freeland, Brazil. And last but not least, Dr. Louise de Waal, the campaign manager for Blood Lions in South Africa. Now, as an international NGO, World Animal Protection greatly values working in collaboration with other civil society organisations. The Civil 20, as many of you will know, is an independent engagement group of the G20, and it's a global platform for civil society organisations, or CSOs, in the G20 process, delivering civil society's demands to world leaders. The C20 community comprises over 1,000 CSOs from all corners of the world, which have been channeling the voice of civil society into the G20 process since 2013. Each year, the C20 convenes voices from CSOs, from non-governmental organisations, NGOs, intergovernmental organisations, global policy experts, and of course, G20 senior officials. Ministerial representatives from G20 and non-G20 countries, activists, and influencer. It's a fantastic mix that come together to determine policy solutions that are required to ensure a more sustainable and, of course, inclusive society. So let me talk just for a few moments about the session that we're running today. The subject of our panel session, as I said earlier, is how to minimise the risk of future pandemic, the role of the global wildlife trade. This is clearly of critical importance, that we take a comprehensive One Health approach when tackling one of the most pressing issues of our time, the current global health pandemic caused by the commercial exploitation of wildlife and our continued encroachment and destruction of wildlife habitat. Now, COVID-19 has had an enormous economic and of course, health impact, which far outweighs any perceived benefits of the wildlife trade. There is therefore a need to consider human, animal, and environmental health and welfare as inextricably interlinked and interdependent. If we didn't know that before, we certainly know it now. Our health, welfare, and livelihoods are dependent on taking a more sustainable approach. This panel aims to provide a consensus that there is an urgent need to stop the commercial exploitation of wildlife and calls for the G20 to make a collective commitment to ban the international and national trade of wild animals and wild animal products. This session will explore the ways for G20 countries to work collectively to combat international trade of wild animals and animal products. It will discuss the potential impact of national and international bans, as well as address methods of tackling the emergence and spread of diseases which stem from the mishandling and exploitation of wildlife. It will include the perspectives of our expert speakers, who are able to shed light on the best practices of both preventative and corrective measures which must be taken to ensure the avoidance of a future pandemic. I would like to add that we kindly invited the German Minister of the Environment, Mrs. Schulze, to participate in this panel session. Now, unfortunately, she is unable to join us today. However, she did send the following message, and I wanted to share this with you. I'm delighted about the invitation, but unfortunately, I will not be able to attend owing to previous commitments. I would, however, like to emphasize that the topic you have chosen is of great importance to me and the entire German government. An ambitious and holistic species conservation strategy is key to reducing the risk of future zoonoses and pandemics. So that's a good point to jump on into the structure of today's session. We're going to start with 5 minutes of introductory, or up to 5 minutes of introductory remarks from each speaker. This will be followed with an open discussion, including questions that are posed to each panelist, but I'm also anticipating they may well get into asking each other some questions along the way. So we'll have a bit of fun in that dialogue. We'll also have some time for questions and answers, I hope, at the end from our audience. And I'd like to encourage you, please, to post your comments and questions in the chat box. And we'll do our best to address as many audience questions as time allows. I'd now like to ask each panelist to introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with our first panelist to give an introduction and their introductory remarks. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you Mr. Claudio Fernandes from Gestos and the C20 International Advisory Committee in Brazil. Claudio.
Thank you very much, Steve. First of all, thank you very much for demo protection, invitation to speak in this panel, specifically to Philip Wilson and João Almeida that reached out so I could have a little bit of a debate. I'm an economist, so I'm going to try and tackle the issue from the financial and commercial determinants of the wildlife, both legal and illegal trade in the world. So I'm going to rewind a little bit back to 2017. It was published in The Lancet in March 2017, an article calling attention to a syndemic in the world, which would be a combination of both extreme poverty that was generating hunger, extreme wealth on the other side, but at the same time commercial determinants that was creating ultra-processed food that is expanding non-communicable disease and amplifying by a lot diabetes type 2 and obesity. And the third major epidemic is the environmental devastation and destruction, including the loss of biodiversity. Well, so here we are, 2020, and we are exactly in the moment where everything that was spoken about before, and when was lots of scientists and lots of good common sense people were speaking about before, that the loss of biodiversity and this exchange and trade of wildlife could have an enormous impact in the world by developing some kind of health epidemic. So here we are, COVID-19 is the result of that process. And how can we stop that from continuing to happen in the future after we pass the COVID-19 emergency phase? So we have to tackle financial and commercial determinants of the wildlife trade. We have to pay attention to illicit financial flows and how financing is also responsible for the expansion of the trade, both legal and illegal. It's quite interesting, for instance, if you do a little research about the big companies, the largest companies in legal wildlife trade in the world, they are usually limited liability companies or limited companies. They're not open corporations. And there's a third category of companies that actually trade in wildlife commerce, which are anonymous corporations in offshore accounts and opaque jurisdictions, as we call them, tax havens. So to conclude here my introduction and these remarks, relating wildlife trade, both legal and illicit wildlife trade, to the money track, meaning how that trade is financed and how that finance is actually going to other areas, like, for instance, the financing of terrorism, the financing of corruption, which was spoken about in the panel before this panel in the C20 summit, which opens up a very large possibility of investigating and actually enforcing better the rule of law and the conventions, particularly the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species and Wildlife and Flora, CITES Convention, and all other 6 conventions on biodiversity, so we can have a better apparatus of investigation by using shared tax information and transparency in financial sharing information. And that way we can try and connect both worlds, illicit financial flows and wildlife trade, and see if we can get a better result in the investigation process. To conclude, just based on the last report of the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes, it was noticed in the report that there is a major necessity to connect those two fields. And so far, the World Bank efforts and also the OECD efforts have not been enough to really open up that channel of investigation. I'll finish for here. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio. Immediately, certainly getting me very interested in exploring the sort of financial route to taking action. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in the discussion. So I'm going to now step over to Canada and Professor Scott Weiss. Scott, I apologize if I know I've got one of those wrong. Over to you.
It's no problem. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate being here. So I'm an infectious disease veterinarian. So I deal with disease at the animal side and particularly at the human-animal interface, with a particular interest in emerging diseases. So diseases that move between species, and that could be animal to human or human to animal. And I think one of the concepts that hopefully we all recognize now, but we're not a population of people living amongst populations of dogs and cats and bats and birds and iguanas and whatever. We're a population of animals. And the microbes don't care if we call ourselves human and we call them non-human. All they care is if we're a host. So the bugs are smarter than us. They're less discriminatory than us, and they're looking for ways to jump between species. Every contact you have with a person creates some risk, right? You know that every time you interact with someone beyond COVID, there's always some chance of transfer of a bacterium, a virus, a parasite, a fungus. Same thing with animals. Every animal poses some risk, but there are situations where we create more risk. And animals we know less about. Animals that we're farther removed from and how we live, and geographically and microbiologically, those create more risk. And the more we move those things around, the more we amplify that risk. And the risk is zoonotic diseases, like I said. So we're worried about infections or bugs that move from animals into people. And this is a really wide topic. We're obviously focused on COVID right now, but this can range from very, very common and very, very mild, something like ringworm, to something that's almost invariably fatal, like rabies, and a lot in between. And you've probably all heard the numbers, over 60, 70% of emerging infectious diseases have an animal origin. And it makes sense because there are a lot more animals, a lot more diversity in animal species than there are us. So it comes down to risk and reward. For me, that's a really big thing with infectious diseases and infection control. What are the risks? How do we manage those risks? And what are the benefits or the rewards? And while we can't dismiss, local, cultural, and food security aspects of animal movement, animal harvesting, we have to think about the broader societal benefit. So the international societal benefit. What's the broad benefit to society of moving animals across large distances, large number of species, mixing them, doing a lot of the things that we do that inherently just don't make sense? Because we have to figure out what the risk is, what the benefit is, and whether it's worth it, or what we can do to reduce those risks. And risk reduction is really the key. Now, obviously, we're focused on COVID. We're not surprised this is happening to some ways. I've got slides from old talks talking about SARS and talking about MERS, 2 other coronaviruses, and saying, what's next? We've had 3 major coronavirus jumps from animals into people in the last 20 years. We had the original SARS from bats through civets and maybe some other species. We have Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome from bats and camels. And now we have this one. So it's not surprising, and we'd be very naive and very foolhardy to think that this is the last one. There are more coronaviruses out there. There are more, you name it, viruses out there. It's been estimated there are 1 to 2 million undiscovered viruses. If a small percentage of those can infect people, a small percentage of 2 million is a lot. So we have to be aware, and I'm not trying to be doomsday, but we have to be aware that there are ever-present risks. If we look at the challenges that we have, we can see how infectious diseases from animals, most often in fairly wild areas, have influenced our society. HIV originated in animals, Ebola virus, Zika virus, diseases of major national and international consequence. Avian influenza, an ever-present risk, is present in the wild bird population. And you can look at some more kind of smaller, lower profile things, but also indicating risk. So an example, New Zealand introduced possums, and they brought with them a bacterium called Mycobacterium bovis, the cause of zoonotic tuberculosis. We don't know how West Nile virus came to North America, but we established a new disease in a new continent. We've seen ticks move, how they move, but sometimes they move on animals, creating potential for tick-borne diseases. We've had a different Ebola virus, Ebola reston, moved into the US from monkeys in a research facility. Fortunately, didn't like people, but just an example of how these things can move. So I can go through an example of this. When we move individuals, we create risk. And that's inherently going to be there. And the more we move them, in terms of numbers, the farther we move them, the more different they are, the more diversity we move, the more risk we create. And then, there's smaller instances that highlight some of these things. And I'll just maybe touch on 1 or 2. I'm going to run out of time, but monkeypox is a good example. There was a monkeypox outbreak in the Midwestern United States a few years ago because, monkeypox, the reservoir isn't monkeys, it's rodents. And rodents were being bought and legally imported into the US, including Gambian giant rats, which are a carrier of the monkeypox virus. They're being mixed with lots of other species in these animal holding units, including prairie dogs, which were also a pet at the time. We know now that prairie dogs are very susceptible. So importing rats that were healthy but had this virus, infecting prairie dogs that were being purchased by people and transmitting monkeypox. So not something we could predict, right? You can say, okay, we can identify some risk. We're not going to identify monkeypox as a risk from prairie dogs, no matter how hard we look. So there are unknowns that are out there. And there are other levels of risk. Just one more example is from a regulatory standpoint, there was no break of psittacosis, a respiratory disease, in border officials in, I believe it was Belgium, from smuggled parakeets. So we can talk about these little small incidents that can cause disease, these broader incidents, and these pandemic global changing incidents that can happen. And, I won't get into risk. We can answer any more questions about that. But the risk is always going to be present. Control measures aren't straightforward. And we have to think about, are we one bad luck incident away from, an individual sick person or a sick family, a local outbreak, a new endemic disease, or a pandemic? And we are. It's one bad luck incident. And SARS-CoV-2, as you know, was originally called the Wuhan coronavirus. With some bad luck, that could have easily been the Tokyo coronavirus or the Toronto coronavirus, the Paris coronavirus, depending where that index case happened. And the more we move animals out, the more we create the risk of that happening. So with that, I think I'm out of time. I'll wrap up, but would certainly love to get into more discussion on this.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate that. I feel even more disturbed after that introduction into the subject than I was before I started. Thanks. I'm sure we'll get into the risk aspects as we get through this session. So I'm going to hand over next to Juliana Machado Ferreira, who is the founder and executive director of Freeland in Brazil. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I will be sharing my screen because I prepared some slides. Just give me one quick moment. Okay, so it's an honor to be here. I'm a biologist and I currently work at Freeland Brazil. Freeland works for a world free of wildlife trafficking and human slavery. And Freeland Brazil's mission is to conserve biodiversity by combating wildlife trafficking. Wildlife trafficking has many serious impacts, and the main one for us here today is how it is a potential source of zoonotic diseases to humans due to inadequate exploitation of and interactions with wildlife. COVID-19 brought sad times to the world. Besides the more than 1 million lives lost, the OECD estimates that by the end of 2021, global income will be $7 trillion lower than what was projected less than a year ago in November 2019. COVID, as it was very well said, it was not the first and it will not be the last. But the dangers are not unknown. There were civets and SARS, camels and mares, primates and Ebola and HIV. Reptiles can carry salmonella, birds can carry chlamydia, herpes virus, burnavirus, circovirus, rodents can cause leptospirosis, hantavirosis, mammals can cause rabies, leprosy, among many, many other examples. The 2020 World Wildlife Crime Report mentions that zoonotic diseases represent up to 75% of all emerging infectious diseases in the world. All wildlife is a potential reservoir of known and unknown, as Dr. Scott said, diseases which can infect humans. But the known diseases are not the main issue. The main issue are the unknowns and the new ones, such as with the mutation that allowed this coronavirus to infect humans. And it's very important to remember that wildlife consumption and exploitation are not restricted to Asia. They occur throughout the world in every single nation. And it takes only one strain of a pathogen to mutate and become as aggressive as this coronavirus. With the current rate of habitat destruction and wildlife exploitation, the probability of other pandemics happening is becoming higher and higher. But wildlife trafficking, now I'm talking about wildlife trafficking, has other negative impacts, such as profound animal suffering, contribution to the spread of invasive alien species, costs of inspection and rehabilitation of animals, extinction of unique populations or of entire species, loss of ecological functions, loss of unique ecosystem services that maintain human economies and well-being, exploitation of people in social vulnerability, and impacts on countries' governance and rule of law. However, what I wanted to mention here today is that not only legally traded wildlife also serves as a potential reservoir of zoonotic diseases, but it acts as a backdoor entrance to illegal wildlife, enhancing all the negative impacts of wildlife trafficking. So in order to deal with this, we need to develop an international legal framework for wildlife crime, and we also need to find ways to adopt the One Health approach. There are several different proposals out there, from regulating the legal trade even more to phasing out global commercial wildlife trade. Freeland is part of the End Pandemics campaign that seeks to end commercial trade in wild animals and to regenerate nature to avoid future pandemics. Always being sensitive to subsistence and indigenous and traditional peoples. And I will ask excuse to show the End Pandemics video.
We knew it was coming. The signs were all there. We knew we had to change. But we didn't. Destroying wild habitats, exploiting wildlife, turning a blind eye. Maybe it would go away. It didn't. It began to bite back. Primates had HIV, civets and SARS, bats and Ebola. COVID-19 is not the first pandemic, and it won't be the last, unless we deal with the root causes. It's time to stop the wildlife trade and to support compassionate, sustainable farming to protect our planet. Let's change our relationship with nature forever, for all life on Earth.
And I rest my case here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Juliana. Great to see that link, of course, also to local communities and that very strong relationship between, of course, the illegal trafficking in animals and, of course, the impacts and trafficking of people. So thank you very much. And I'm going to now go to Louise, Dr. Louise Deval, who works for an organisation I'm proud to say has been a partner of World Animal Protection, Blood Lions in South Africa. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you very much. I'm also going to share my screen, so give me a second to make that work. And yeah, I think the previous speakers have actually set the scene very nicely for me. I hope you can all see my screen by now. So what I would like to do is actually put a little case study together here. So South Africa is one of the few countries in Africa that allow the intensive captive breeding and keeping of lions and other big cats for commercial purposes. And that's what I would like to use as a case study. So from the late 1990s, this industry has been allowed to grow to an estimated 450 farms holding between 10 and 12,000 lions and hundreds of other indigenous and exotic big cats. The exploitation of captive lions happens at every single stage of their life as part of a very long economic value chain. From the moment they're born and paying volunteers are hand-rearing the cubs, used as for cub petting and selfie opportunities, killed in captive hunts, sold in live trades and slaughtered for their bones. South Africa has created the demand for lion bones to supplement the tiger bone trade since about 2008, and more than 6,000 lion skeletons have been exported to Southeast Asia for the use in traditional Asian medicine practices. In 2016, an official bone quota from the captive population was agreed at the CITES COP17 through an annotation in the Appendix 2. Subsequently, our Department of Environment set a legal export quota of 800 skeletons per year in both 2017 and 18. So South Africa, as so many other countries globally, have allowed this industry and related international trade in lion trophies, live animals, bones and body parts without any knowledge on potential health risks associated with this trade or the risk to wild lion populations. So with the world in hard lockdown, Blood Lions and World Animal Protection actually embarked on the study to compile a list of pathogens known to affect African lions in order to understand these health risks associated with the commercial farming. So we conducted a systematic review of existing scientific literature for a 10-year period and reviewed 148 peer-reviewed papers at neck-breaking speed, I have to say. We identified a total of 63 pathogens that were recorded in both wild and captive lions. More than half were parasites, followed by viruses and bacteria. And this includes pathogens that can be passed from lions to other animals and also to humans. So yeah, we're creating these opportunities for transmission. We also found a total of 83 diseases and clinical symptoms associated with these pathogens. Many pathogens are highly contagious and cause significant morbidity or mortality with disease, often triggered through very high stress situations. For example, after repeated periods of pregnancy or after creating and transportation, as is common practice in this industry. The high number of associated pathogens is highly worrying, considering the industry actively promotes interaction between wild animals and people, whether these are paying tourists, volunteers, farm workers, taxidermists, or abattoir workers. In addition, most of these activities have no official health and hygiene standards and create opportunities for spread of zoonotic diseases. Given the conditions in which the lion farming industry currently operates in South Africa and the lion's susceptibility to such a wide range of multi-host pathogenic organisms, it's likely that the captive lions could play a central role in the emergence, amplification, and transmission of diseases not only to people, but also to wild animal populations. And wild populations are not just on the threat from zoonotic disease spillover from captive populations, but also from poaching. And the impact of the captive breeding industry on wild lions, on shared ecosystems, as well as neighboring lion populations, is currently really very poorly understood. However, more and more evidence is becoming available that Asian demand for tiger and lion bones and other body parts is driving the illegal killings. So, for example, the African Lion Database is collecting data on lion mortality across Africa. And as you can see here, hotspots are already starting to form. Now, their initial data, it's very initial. If we start to plot that data of lion mortality over time, we can see that it's sort of increasing and there's a little spike already occurring. The dark green line at the bottom is actually lions that are being killed and the body parts being harvested. But if we start plotting the lion bone trade from South Africa over time in the same graph, we can definitely see a trend emerge. And we really need more research to fully understand what this trade is doing to our wild population as well. Many scientists believe that there may be as few as 15,000 wild lions left in the world. So, considering the human suffering and the economic impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic, we need to ask the question, does South Africa, or for that matter, any other country with commercial captive wildlife populations, want to risk being the center of a future zoonotic outbreak or species extinction? And as Scott was saying, it could be the Cape Town coronavirus or the Bloemfontein coronavirus. And I would like to leave that thought with you.
Thank you so much, Louise. Okay, so great insight, great introductions from all of the panelists, different angles as well to what's obviously a complex issue. I'd like to get into the next session now as a group and get into some of the discussion. And I hope to perhaps open, picking up Scott on your presentation. One of the things that struck me as you were talking was, the level of awareness. In fact, as others were speaking too, the level of awareness of the virus risks and the history of virus impacts on humans from animals that we've been aware of over many years. And I wonder, from your point of view, what action do you feel has been taken in the past, and do you feel now, that there's a serious prospect that regulatory bodies and others, policymakers, will actually do something that will really make a difference.
Well, I'd say if we don't get action now, we never will. Like, if this isn't the motivation to do it, which is why we have to act now. I think in the past, you've seen responses that have been variable, token, and not followed through from a couple standpoints. So infection control is inherently reactive, and infection control is inherently cumbersome, right? We bring in restrictions or regulations or other steps, and people don't like that. If you just come in and say, don't do that, or do this differently, and you don't address why and how and provide support for that and address underlying causes, it doesn't work. So if you look at wet markets, so the response in Asia most recently was to close down wet markets, but anecdotally it sounds like those closures have been fairly short-term and partial. So there's got to be motivation to actually do it, as opposed to say we did something. And there's a lot of, we did something is what people want to say, as opposed to actually doing something. But at the same time, you have to figure out, okay, why are these things, why are exports happen? Why are exotic pets there? Why are wet markets there? Because if we don't address the underlying cause, we don't get any benefit, because we don't get compliance. And we get underground trade. So a worst case scenario probably within a wet market is an underground wet market where there's no tracking, no regulation, no monitoring. So we need to figure out why they're there, come in with responses. So you support people that are using that for their food sources or for their income. And you figure out, you engage local to think about the cultural issues and the community issues that are there. And I think that's the problem. This is inherently a very complicated situation, and it's going to require an inherently very complicated response. And we don't like to do that. We like to be able to say, don't do that. Have a good day. See you later. Or, fill out this paperwork before you do it. We don't get into the cultural issues. And I think in the scientific community, one of the things that we don't do well is engage the social scientific community. The science is easy for a lot of these things. It's behavior change and culture change and attitude change. And we don't do a very good job looking at those components. We can do a great job sequencing the virus and tell you where it came from. But, we can't do as good a job telling people, wear a mask. So I think I've got off topic a little bit here, but I think this, to me, shows the complexity of the issue. So we have had responses, but we haven't had the depth of responses and the breadth of responses in the past. And I think even in response to this, we're not getting it. Because if you look from a One Health standpoint, when this virus first emerged, we were raising the animal question. In January, I was on the phone raising the animal question. Okay, we need to pay attention to domestic animals and moving animals around, because we don't know who's susceptible. And the response was, yeah, that's interesting. And that was about it, right? And then, World Health Organization came out, CDC came out saying, there's no evidence that animals are involved in the transmission. Which is true, because if you don't look, you don't find. And we got lucky that animals don't play a significant role in transmission, but we got lucky. It's sad to say, but we got lucky with this virus so far. We got lucky that there weren't animal sources, there were reservoirs that we know of yet. And we got lucky that this doesn't kill like MERS, which kills 30% of people. So yes, this is a horrible situation, but we got lucky because of some of the things that we didn't do. It didn't end up kind of biting us at the end. So sorry, that gets kind of way off topic, but maybe that sets the scene for some more discussion.
No, I think it's a really good point, because I think most people would not, I'm sure, listening to this and watching this, feel like we got lucky. Yeah. But actually, it's probably fair to say, certainly historically, we've been very lucky. So where do we go from here? I just wonder if we don't take action. And I'm sorry if I come across as one of those campaigners that are a little bit cynical here. But if we don't take that sort of joined up action, that sort of action globally, what do we face going forward? I mean, Scott, interested in your comment, and then if anyone else wants to come in on that question.
Well, I'm happy to comment. If someone wants to jump in first, so you're not just hearing me ramble all the time, I'm happy to let someone else start it off.
If I may, I'd like to call attention to two systemic issues that underlines the whole problem of wildlife trade, both legal and illegal. One systemic, structural, and historical issue is a cultural issue, but more than cultural is an ethical issue. And ethical in the point of view of how we human beings actually see nature as a resource that can be changed with technology for our own use. It's kind of interesting because it brings together two people that are not very similar, Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, and the Indian chemist called Narendranath Mukherjee, that wrote an incredible book called Economics Integral, or Integral Economics, or Natural Economics, that considers the fact that we live in a complex system in the sense of biology complexity. And social environment and social interactions also run through the complex systems processes and multiplicities. So the ethical aspect and the way that we actually interact with nature is the first and foremost part that actually sustain, the whole process throughout history, and how it came about to do something that, as Scott Weiss talked about, which was the irrationality of moving animals around, that we recognized during the mercantilism. That was okay, people are just moving things around. But 20th century, 21st century, to actually be financing that kind of moving around and putting the whole world at risk of zoonotic disease, it needs to be better reflected upon. And the second point is exactly the financial determinant. Who pays for it? So we have an ethical cultural aspect that actually transcends, for instance, cultural heritage. Let's say that a very rich person in the US, son of a very powerful person of the most powerful country in the world, just decides to go to Africa for poaching. Okay? But that is also encouraged by the fact that the whole colonialist mentality is something that commands geopolitics. So we are here, C20, and we want to make a case for the G20, the 20 most powerful countries in the world as far as economic output, and the European Union. And we have to say that colonial mentality is in the root of the problem, both personal in the ethical aspect and the political and economic aspect of just getting to nature with this concession way of thinking it. It's there for us to take it. And to conclude in this remark is the point of international financial institutions are extremely important in this fight. There is a need for conditionality on financial aid, on financial credit, on several financial instruments for countries to actually get away from the primary export of wildlife and natural. Diversify the economy. And here to really finish, just look at the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, okay? And interesting enough, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for Financing for Sustainable Development. They both talk about the fact that trade agreements need to respect the conventions and the past agreements. But then we have a problem of enforcement and we have a problem of leniency. And I'll let the other speakers talk about it.
May I, Scott, Steve? I think it's very interesting to note that up until a few years ago, all issues concerning wildlife, both legal and illegal trade, they were in the conservation realm, biologists, scientists, CITES. But in the past few years, illegal wildlife trade, wildlife trafficking has been treated more and more like a crime, like a security and governance issue. And for example, the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement has been dealing with this. UNODC has been dealing with this. So when wildlife trafficking went from a conservation issue to a crime, to a security issue, it got more attention, it got people talking about it. In the same way, the legal trade has been supported with our argument that it's an interesting industry, the economic argument that it's not so valid anymore. Because even if we take all gains of the past 100 years, they are still smaller than what the world's going through right now with this pandemic, and will go through again if we don't act. So now it's an economic issue and it's a health issue, world health issue. So I think that what allows me to have some hope is that we are going from conservationists talking to conservationists to people talking about health, economy, security. And this makes people look at it. So you asked what have been done. Well, before, the only legal framework we had to control international trade of animals was CITES. And it still is, actually. But now we have people talking about listing wildlife trafficking under the UN Convention on Organized Crime, which is very interesting. And I know that several organizations are going after that, including, I recently saw a talk by John Scallon, former CITES secretary and current chairman, I think, of the End Wildlife Crime Initiative. And I heard lots of people talking about that we need to develop a global framework to deal with wildlife trade while we don't manage to phase out and end the commercial trade, but something like a global Lacey Act, citing the US law. Because I don't know if our viewers know, but CITES cover only the international trade of the species that are listed under the 3 appendices. And listing these species is more a political and economical choice than a technical one. Whereas if we have an animal which is protected by origin and not listed in CITES, when it crosses international borders, crosses the country's national borders, there is no framework for countries to deny its entrance unless we're talking about maybe sanitary issues. But with this global Lacey Act, what they've been calling, the importer would have to prove the legality of the animal in the source. And if the wildlife or product was illegal, then the importer could prosecute the person importing it in the importer country. So this would be something that we could do while we work to phase this out, because I think people need to understand it's not a question of whether we need to phase out the big commercial wildlife trade, is how and when. Thank you.
And maybe, I may be the doom and gloom guy here, I guess, today, but from the motivating standpoint, we have to realize that like right now we are in a better position in terms of risk probably than we will be maybe ever, because things are getting worse. If you look at what are the major threats to society, you've got a whole list of them. You've got climate change, you have armed conflict, you have urban expansion. All of those are directly tied to risk of pandemics. Climate change in particular, we have changes in ranges of organisms. You have mosquitoes that can survive where they couldn't before. We have animal ranges that move. We have loss of biodiversity, and loss of biodiversity can increase risk of movement and creation of reservoirs. We have urban expansion, which brings us in closer contact with animals that we have areas we haven't been in before. And they're great examples of that. Obviously, Brazil is a good example of that. There are various places in the world where we're seeing this incursion. As people have more money, they have more desire for animal protein, which, sometimes that's commercially produced and sometimes that's bushmeat. And we have a mobile population, and all these things tied together. The more climate change, the more expansion, the more armed conflict, the more people, the more migration is going to happen. And if we have mass migration, uncontrolled migration with armed conflict, you get breakdowns in controls, and you get increases in risk. So all these things are intertwined. And I think we sometimes forget that. The climate change group is meeting here, right? And whatever group is meeting here, and the wildlife group or pandemic group is meeting here. And they all influence each other, or at least they all influence the pandemic risk. We're the ones that kind of get all the bad news that comes from all those changes. So we have to remember that we've got a situation right now where it's been highlighted that we have a serious issue, and it's going to happen again, and our risk for that is going to continue. So we need to act to prevent this. And one of the problems we have with pandemic prevention or infection control in general is, if I wrote a proposal last year saying I wanted to do something, and we might have a big outbreak in the next year or so, or 10 years, and it's cost trillions of dollars and millions of lives, someone's going to look at it and say, yeah, right? They're going to say no. And if we actually got money and implemented it, we try to renew that money, they say, well, we spent X million dollars and nothing happened. So why should we keep putting money into that? Well, because you put the money into it, right? That's the whole problem we run into with infection control and prevention is when we succeed, we demotivate. So again, we've got a whole range of things we have to think about how we get sustained interest in reducing risk. That's reducing animal movement, reducing disease movement, and a whole range of things. Again, it's the complexity, but we have to keep working with the motivation and explaining that and take advantage. It's unfortunate to say, but you don't let a disaster go to waste in terms of improving to prevent the next one.
Thank you, Scott. Talking of not letting disasters go to waste, Louise, as you look at it from where you are, the situation where you are in South Africa, where do you see the opportunities for the global community to take action?
Yeah, I think we also need to be very cognizant. I was just listening to a lot of the comments being made, what the international community can do, but I think we also need to be very cognizant of what is actually happening on country levels and how the national governments are looking at these issues of wildlife trade and the reasons that they put behind the justification of this trade. Because without solving those problems, we can ask the global community to do whatever they like. But if the national communities, the national governments are not going to come to some kind of agreement with the global community, there's not going to be a solution. And if I look, for example, here in South Africa, but I think I can talk certainly with respect to quite a few of the African countries, they are very much of the opinion that the use of wildlife is as a resource and as an economic resource is part of our rights. And it also goes back again. I think, Claudio, you actually mentioned it, the sort of the whole colonial era, and that is now being used and being sort of moved forward into what South Africa is now claiming. No, it's part of our constitution. The whole sustainable utilization of wildlife is part of our constitution. It's part of our rights of bill. So I think we have to sort of start a little bit lower down to try and get the national governments to agree that really the path we're on is not sustainable. And, we're all using this word sustainable utilization, but it's not sustainable. We've seen that now. And so I think that goes with a lot of understanding and also listening to the local communities, like Juliana was saying as well. It's something that we cannot overlook, to also involve local communities and listening to their voices and their needs. And so, yeah, it is a very complex situation that will not be resolved. But I fully agree with everybody on the panel that we've never had a better opportunity than we do have at the moment. And I think we have to use that opportunity to accelerate the process. And I think as a result of this pandemic, maybe governments will listen and are more willing to listen to the potential health hazards. And like we've shown in the captive breeding industry, which is a very contentious topic anyway, that we now also have this pool of pathogens that can suddenly emerge into a new disease that can then move to either wildlife and leading to maybe extinction of certain species in the wilds and to humans as well.
I agree that there is a problem that many countries feel they have the right to exploit wildlife, and that there is this argument that they say that the countries which are already developed, they don't want other countries to develop and then compete as superpowers. And this is a twisted argument. But the problem is that if from one side, the international community has the duty to help and support and finance livelihoods and phasing out and changing of industries, we have abandoned detrimental industries before. We have done that and we have to do it again. But the international community has this duty. It also should act as somehow to ensure compliancy, because there is no way that one country decides that they don't want to protect biodiversity and nature may expose us all, the entire world, to a new pandemic. No country has this right. So from one side, communities have all the right to have sustainable livelihoods, and countries have the right to find their ways to develop economically. No one has the right to put us all in danger. So we need to change the mindset, and we need to come together as an international community to work with those countries who are more reflective, both with incentives as well as with strong pressure.
Thank you. And I guess it sort of leads to an inevitable question then, who's going to be responsible for ensuring there's accountability, for those who breach international agreements surrounding any sort of ban? Is it the role of governments? And we've talked about the sort of local angle. Is it the role of intergovernmental bodies? I mean, who's going to take this on? Claudio, your thoughts?
Thank you, Steve. Very excellent remarks from everybody. Before answering your question in a very objective way, I'm just going to highlight exactly what Juliana talked about, which is, I'm a multidisciplinary economist, and one of the lines of my study is semiotics, because semiotics is the root of ideology, and ideology is pretty much how you fake things and how you construct lies that are very well put together that they look like truth. So in the case of what Juliana just spoke about, that's called the comparative advantage economics that was brought about 200 years ago by David Ricardo, that said, your country is good to export wildlife, so then you keep on exporting wildlife and then you're going to develop on that. And that's a typical ideological type of hegemonic speech and narrative that is absorbed nationally, as Dr. Louise said. This hegemonic type of semiotics creates subjectivities that actually encourage that type of practice, even if it's absolutely wrong, but they don't question. And now in the age of social networks and fake news, this just exploded, right? And here I'm going to bring what really creates a very complicated situation is the concrete economic aspect of it. So it's estimated that the legal wildlife trade is about $300 billion, annually. And it was estimated that the illicit wildlife trade was between $7 and $23 billion. This was estimated about 2-3 years ago. So this year, the World Bank actually just put a report, and luckily I found this report, that they are actually estimating the collection of illegal fishing, wildlife trade, and illegal timber trafficking into $1 trillion. So this is the big incentive to keep on the trade, right? This is where the money speaks the most. So like it is extremely profitable, and it is extremely asymmetric as well. So now to answer your question specifically, I would say that we need to raise the issue in such a drastic emergency style of narrative that it needs to first and foremost reach the UN Security Council, because that's where binding decisions are made. Conventions, agreements, and everything that goes through the national process, that's not all binding, and sometimes it's so. So National Security Council, this is about world security. We change, as Juliana said, we change completely the narrative. We need that. We need to actually develop a narrative that wildlife trade is a security risk for not only the humans, but actually for thousands and thousands and millions of species and the planet life in itself. Then we have to bring in WTO, which is already on board. But I was just listening today, for instance, for one speech, and the WTO secretary was saying, legal wildlife trade can be a solution for the illegal wildlife trade. I say no more. Juliana spoke about that in her presentation. A third institution that we need in this is the World Health Organization. We need a multidisciplinary, multilateral institutional arrangement that can create that type of framework that Juliana and Dr. Luis talked about. So we need the donor countries, the international financial institutions, and then we need who actually drives the whole narratives to change things in the world, us. civil society organization, investigative journalism, national security apparatuses that are not caught into the whole corruption cycle, because it's complicated in that aspect as well. And the last but not least is public opinion, because public opinion really shifts things, right? And for that, we need popular culture. So it kind of reminded me of Rio, that, animated cartoon that touched a little bit about that, about wildlife trade, because there was this macaw, blue macaw living in Canada, and then he comes back to Brazil, the story. So we need Disney on board. We need DreamWorks on board. We need Universal on board. We need popular culture. We need music. We need all this. So it's a collection. It's not as simple, of course. It's a complex system, but we need institutions, rule of law, and popular culture, but to be very precise, UN Security Council and international financial institutions with financial conditionalities that can move the needle very fast.
I think your last point is really key about that local aspect, because we need education, because there's a question, and we can get to more detail into the chat about regulations. And regulations, we've talked about some of the issues there, but if there's not local support for regulations, governments don't want to enforce them. Right? Ultimately, a government wants to stay in power, and who's going to use political capital for something that's widely unpopular? So if we don't get at that ground level, so, me, some economically advantaged Canadian going to China and say, don't use wet markets, they're not going to listen to me, and they shouldn't, right? But, their elder or the kids, which is where the generational shift is happening, you mentioned, that's how we need to do it. So there needs to be a really targeted education. And we're not going to fix this in a week or a month or a year, right? This is a generational change. Doesn't mean we can't make things better immediately, but there has to be the long game thought too. So we need to really think about local-based education of all the people, like the users, the producers, the general public. And I think we also have to think about, again, why is this happening? It's still, for me, I really want to get to the why whenever I address this. And maybe there's some analogies to the drug trade. And there are all the debates, is it supply or demand? Do you go after drug dealers and drug makers, or do you go after drug users? And you can't just go after one, right? If you just address supply, there will be someone else to supply. So again, the demand aspect has to be brought in there. We need to think about this. And we talk about ecologically, but we have to think about trade ecologically too, which is everyone in that whole cycle, and to figure out how we can intervene, because there are different ways to do that. Regulation is part of it. Education is part of it. Enforcement is part of it. Peer pressure, public pressure is a huge one.
And I think that there are tools, there are international tools. So when countries are not compliant to other conventions or agreements, there are tools to pressure them, temporary bans. There are other kinds, these kinds of things exist in other situations and other crimes. So we have international conventions on organized crime. We have in-country mechanisms to combat them, but when countries are not compliant, we have ways to pressure them. And we have CITES. CITES is comprised of 193 countries. Of course, it's a continuum. We're not going to ban the trade tomorrow. We have to come together as a society to see how we're going to do that. But why we don't achieve that? Why not criminalize wildlife trafficking and not just penalizing it? Why not use these international tools that exist for other situations to pressure countries? Again, I love what Dr. Scott said. Two things, and it's all the key. We have supply and demand, and we have risk and benefit. If we take these four little words, they answer pretty much everything. So why are people doing this? Where does this desire come from of owning an exotic pet or an exotic leather purse? Why do we need that? Before, it was a gray area. I want my individual right. But now we know it's about us all. It's about collective. It's about society. And there is no more excuse. So we just need to come together and see how we can do this. And I say, let's look at other international frameworks and use them as basis. The tools are all there. We just need the political will.
Yeah, I think political will is very, very important. However, if I if I look at on a national level here in South Africa. And I think in many ways, we're such a good case study because we're trying to develop this whole wildlife economy in South Africa. So one of the things that our government is starting to get quite worried about is actually our reputational damage to our conservation image, to our tourism brand. And I think that is where the international community can play an important role, because that is how the international community looks at us as an individual country. And especially now in, past the sort of first stage of COVID, if you like. I don't really want to sort of talk post-COVID yet, but post the first sort of stage. And lots of countries are now going around because they need loans. Everybody is in dire economic straits. So they don't want other nations to have this bad look on their country, because they want to be seen as a positive economic nation that can compete on an international level. So I think the reputational damage is something that we can also capitalize on, if you like, from an international platform. But I also very much agree with people very often don't feel that way. But if the public really rallies around and if we all come together, that is an extremely powerful voice to have.
I think that this is great and it makes all the sense in the world, but some governments are not as sensitive to their reputations. And what we're seeing that
can you name one?
I'm not naming, but what I'm seeing that may work is, I hate to say that and it's cynical, but money speaks loud. So when some countries decide to stop buying produce from these countries because they're not being compliant with the environmental protection, then people feel in their pockets and they demand action from the government. So I agree, both things should run in parallel, but money speaks.
Yeah, we almost, I think we have started this conversation with money, and Claudio opened us up with the sort of issue of finance, and that finance is so critical, and the tools and measures that can be brought in on that financial side are so critical to clamping down on the trade. I guess the part of this discussion that always goes through my mind, is that action won't be taken, enough action won't be taken by governments and financial community, but where it is taken, it may be much more focused on actions against what we call the illegal trade, or specific centres like wet markets, the things that are in the public eye, as you were talking about, Scott, earlier. The issue people don't want to tackle, and it's a tough one when it comes to educating people, is the legal trade, and how much of this business is, if you like, happening under the skirts of a legal trade. And I wonder if anyone wants to just pick up on that issue in terms of how you see the role of the legal trade, and whether you feel it's time for governments and other bodies to take action, not just on illegal, but legal trade as well. Louise, maybe you want to kick off on that one.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Yes, I think we can't really talk about the one without talking about the other as well, because we all know that as soon as we've got a legal trade, the illegal trade actually will piggyback onto that. So it's always nice, and it seems so simple in a way to say, oh, let's just focus on illegal trade and get rid of that. So I think it is always sort of this idea of if we get rid of the illegal trade, the legal trade it would be okay, and we can deal with that. But we all know that's not the case. And when we look at enforcement agencies, it's extremely difficult as well when they get a consignment that is intercepted somewhere. How can you tell that whether this was obtained legally or illegally? Because is it from the wild population? Is it from a captive population? Because there's also consignments. So when I look, for example, South Africa again, there are consignments, for example, of lion bones that go out illegally because they don't have the right permits, but they come from the captive population. But all sorts of other things can be mixed up in there. So yeah, this whole legal illegal trades discussion, I think, is such a difficult one because the two are completely intertwined in my minds. And I think if we are looking at sort of how can we actually come up with a system that we can ban at least a large extent of the wildlife trade, is going to be quite a difficult one. Obviously, a blanket ban is the easiest because then everything that is going around globally is going to be illegal. Easy to enforce, easy to police. Are we going to get the political will to get a complete global ban? Is a very big question mark. So then it's the question, where do we draw the line? What do we still feel is acceptable? What's not? So can we, for example, say the trade in products for sustenance is allowable or acceptable, but luxury good is not? But then it's also, how do we define those? How are we going to make sure that there aren't any loopholes? Because that is the other thing I find incredibly difficult when we start talking about organizations like CITES and agreements, and there's always loopholes for people to find and to use for their own purpose and advantages. So yeah, it's not an easy answer. I hope that it helps.
I'm sure there's a lot of views, Juliana.
I'm sorry. So I completely agree with Dr. Louise, and one feeds the other. There is no way out of this sentence. One feeds the other. And we don't apply the best traceability methods that we have currently today. We should have e-permits and we don't. We should use DNA testing and we don't. We should use stable isotope testing and we don't. We don't already do it. Why expect that, from now on, we're going to start applying? It's all about the money. People say that testing takes time, it's laborious. So I have a hard time believing that the legal trade industry is going to adapt itself. However, I think that if we can decrease the volume, so as Dr. Louise said, maybe just allow for the subsistence and for livelihoods. If we have smaller volume, then enforcement becomes easier because currently the biggest problem we have is telling the legal from illegal. Now we have Dr. Scott here, and I don't want to teach the priest how to say a mass, but all wildlife, again, is a potential reservoir of zoonotic diseases. It doesn't matter if they're legal or illegal, they carry pathogens. And I just wanted to share an example from a rehabilitation center for seized wildlife here in Brazil. And this is new, this is from last year. They started to detect viruses in cetaceans, parrots and macaws, which they didn't before. These animals were carrying viruses without symptoms, without presenting a disease, without anyone knowing. They were tested because somehow, suddenly, other animals from that triage facility started to display symptoms of that disease. So we have circoviruses, bornaviruses, and other sorts of viruses. And these animals had no symptoms and they were going to someone's house. So I always say that, of course, we need to work to keep cultures, singing, writing, poetry, artisan work, handcraft work, but cultures should and can evolve. We are not stuck in 400 years ago. We're not doing the same things. We don't have the same customs and habits. Why are we so reluctant saying, oh, but it's my culture to keep this animal at home? Come on, a few years ago, you couldn't even bring this animal from Australia into Brazil. But even if it is, so Brazilians have kept wild animals in their homes for years and years, local wildlife, native wildlife. Why not change what society now sees that is detrimental? Let's keep our energy to save what's important and not so detrimental. So we should, we have to.
So I love that passion. Thank you so much. Actually, I'm going to go to you, Scott, next, if you don't mind. Maybe you could pick up on this issue. But I also just want to say, I'm meant to be keeping an eye on the time, but we're coming close to the end. So anyone who has a question or a comment, please fire it into the chat box, and we'll take a look and put that into the room. But Scott, over to you.
Yes, sorry, I got cut off there, so I missed some discussion. So I don't know if there's anything specifically you want me to address. I think there were some great points by Juliana there, and I think it really starts to bring everything together. I think comment there, what are the next steps? And it's tough because I'm not sure what the next steps really are, right? I think the next steps are groups like this. I think it's that engaging multidisciplinary areas with different backgrounds and figuring out what we can do. And I think it's a combination. There are some very low-hanging fruit, if you use that, maybe just, I'm sure people know that analogy, but there's it's very straightforward things. You sit back and you look at it and you say, that's dumb, right? We can do this really easily. And whether that's just, counting number of animals that come in, getting an idea what happens, whether it's recording information. We're even dealing with this in importation of dogs into Canada. We bring in tens of thousands of dogs, and we brought some pretty serious diseases in, and we don't know how many come in. We have no restrictions there. So I think understanding what's happening, it's like any other problem. We need to define the problem better. And we need to define what's factors associated with that problem. We need to look at existing controls or lack of controls. And then we need to figure out, the short, medium, and long-term plan. And there's some things that countries could do right now in education and restriction and regulation and monitoring to address some basic issues. And we can bring those in probably easily right now because there's motivation. And then there's the 5-10 generational window, which is, ultimately, where do we want to be in 2 years is one question. Where do we want to be in 30 years is another question. And I think we could probably be a lot similar on our where do we want to be in 30 years answer than maybe in the 2 years, depending on how pessimistic we are. But I think we still need to define the problem. We need to identify what we can do to reduce that risk, and then think about how we're going to address it, because how we address it in Canada is going to be different than how we address it in Brazil, and how you're going to address it in China. And even within countries, there are different reasons that people do things. Like the pet trade is different than the medicinal product trade, that is different than the bushmeat trade. And you can name a few other trades. So there is no one size fits all approach to this. So we have to, again, look at the complexity of the issues and figure out what we can do. And we also need to think about the unintended consequences. And often, we can take a little simplistic approach at this, but when we start to intervene, this is where you need to assess what happens. So we need to bring in something, we need to do it, we need to see if it worked. And why didn't it work? Because some things won't work, and we need to figure out what happens there. And were there any unintended consequences, which meant driving things underground, making things worse, creating different risks, depriving women of their economy. So if you look at some areas, restricting some trades, if in some populations it's the women that are really dependent on that. So if we deprive them of income, what are the downstream effects of that without the appropriate supports? So we have to make sure we don't oversimplify it, especially from a Western standpoint, that we don't oversimplify and just try to say, do this, right? We did this 50 years ago. Well, things are different than they were 50 years ago, right? Again, I'm not sure I really answered your question, but I think, again, it's the complexity of the issue. We need to really think about it in a multidisciplinary manner, including social scientists, biologists, ecologists, veterinarians, physicians, and everyone, and start figuring out where we can start.
My turn to be on mute. I also have roofers, Juliana. So I'm in Italy and you're in Brazil, and we've both got roofers, either with huge hammers, one set of roofers or two. But Claudio, I just want to, Juliana actually put this question into the box, but who's going to pay for this? It's not going to be me. I know that much. Any thoughts?
Thanks, Steve. Yes, that's actually the excellent question, because it's in the root of the problem is the fact that there is a very wide and deep asymmetry between the profits made off of both legal and illegal trade and the amount of resources that is dedicated to the agencies that are supposed to enforce the laws on both legal and illegal trade. Because there are problems both in the legal and the illegal trade, as Scott has said, and not only on the aspect of pathogens and transportation of that, but also in the sanitary aspects of it. And many times you have situations of wet markets. Oh, there's a little tail. Wet markets where the whole problem is actually the sanitary, health aspect of it. Here in Brazil, we still have that, even though with all fiscalization and the aspect. So who's going to pay for that? So first of all, we need to have a better enforcement of the conventions and the agreements and the laws of the countries. The second part is trade agreements need to include the issue in their negotiations. Right now, not right now, actually, for the past 20 years, there's a huge negotiation between the European Union and Mercosur, which is the, free market of South America. And one of the issues that actually has stopped the process, even though has been approved, the first draft of the agreement, but the European Union right now is extremely concerned about the fact that biodiversity is being wiped out in Brazil, major problem in the environment that everybody is seeing, and also the fact that there is quite a bit of wildlife trade. So that's a way of enforcing, but on the other end, the European Union can also finance better strategies to actually combat the trade and support strategies in a multilateral level that would combat the trade. And here I'm just going to raise two strategies that actually are part of the international financial architecture reform that we, civil society, and the Financing for Development group has been asking for the past 5 years. First, we need a beneficial ownership registry. There's no way in the 21st century that you can still have a company with no owners. That's a major breach in transparency and accountability, and we cannot have a system like that. And the second is the automatic exchange of tax information, because that's how you trace the financing prospects that keeps that industry alive. And here I talk industry because when we talk about indigenous population, when Juliana talked about, for instance, the cultural argument for defending certain situations like that, I would like to call attention to one thing, which is FTM, the female mutilation, which is part of culture in certain countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but it defies gender equality in a big way. And it's not possible anymore to just accept that with the excuse of cultural, elements for it. And the second point that I'm going to finish very fast is I did a study before on illegal cigarette trade. And it's quite interesting because the illegal cigarette trade has been financed by the legal cigarette companies. So if that's an example, I think we should follow that track.
I think it's a great linking example. It takes us back to the question a short time ago about the legal and the illegal and the separation of those. I want to leave the last word actually to you, Louise. I hope you don't mind in terms of this panel discussion. We're directing this, this conversation and the conversation here with the C20 is obviously aimed towards the G20. If you had an ask of them, what is it?
I think, because I think we can talk about all of this, and I think it follows on what Claudia was just saying as well. The ask would be that there will be some proper alternatives put on the table from the international communities as an incentive for countries to actually stop these wildlife trades. Because as Juliana was saying earlier as well, it's in the end of the day, it all revolves around money. So we can't just say we end the trade and that's it. You have to come up with alternatives. So I think this whole rejection of a global wildlife trade could really open up a very much needed space for innovation and creativity, when we talk about alternatives and culturally appropriate sources of income created for communities. So I think, and I think what Scott also was saying, they need to be carefully planned to avoid any unintended consequences for both livelihoods, but also for species conservation. And one of the obvious one that a lot of people always straight away come up with, especially in Africa, let's do photographic safaris. And yes, it can create sustainable economic opportunities and conservation alternatives in some countries. But again, it's not a one size fits all kind of scenario. We need to have a multiple offering of alternatives. We need to look at payment of ecological services schemes, sort of a debt for nature kind of initiatives. We need to look at maybe incentives for people to start putting larger areas under nature conservation, also with an idea to for carbon storage. And I think the Western world, Europe and North America, could help in that respect, because in the developing world, generally speaking, we still have a little bit more space, and we can probably put more land under conservation for that purpose than Europe could do. So yeah, I think what I would like to see from the G20, that they would come up with some real life alternatives that they can say, look, okay, we need to tackle this whole wildlife trade, but here are some incentives for countries to implement that, and here are some alternatives in terms of economic and livelihoods. Yeah, so that would be one of my asks.
That's
just a small one.
Yeah, I didn't forewarn you getting that last question, so well done. And I know everyone would have something to contribute in there, and I'm sorry we are running out of time. We're on the brink of being closed now. I have no idea how many people have joined us in this conversation, but I've certainly enjoyed it very much. It's, we've travelled quite a way from the start of the conversation. I want to thank Juliana, Louise, Claudio, and Scott for your contributions, for making my life actually incredibly easy in moderating this thing. I've learned that the art of moderation is largely to sit back and enjoy a fantastic conversation between some very smart people. I think we've learned an awful lot of stuff about wildlife, some of which will be probably sending us to bed tonight with more nightmares. Thank you for that, Scott. But also some hope for the future. So come on, G20, let's have some action on behalf of wildlife, and let's deal with the pandemic risks to human populations. Thank you, everybody, for your time.
Thank you, Steve.